Hi, welcome back to my fashion studio. We're talking about seam finishes and the seam finishes that are used in the apparel industry. So the next one we're going to talk about and learn how to do is called the Hong Kong seam finish. And I know that's a lot of a big name, but it's a really cool seam finish that you can add contrast or like really interesting material to the look of the inside of your garment. This is mainly used in coats and jackets where if you don't want a total lining, but you want to cover the seam finishes and make them look really cool. So jackets, coats, that kind of stuff. So we're gonna get started here. I have my same black material because we're just doing technique. I already have it stitched together with the right sides together, and I'm ready to do my technique. So what you need to do is get a fabric that you want to use for it. It can be, I could use black and have it all the same, but I'm using this contrasting material, and I cut it at 1 1/8 inch wide. And you move this out of the way. And our first step is we're gonna be looking at just one side of the seam allowance. And we're gonna take our material that is cut, and it's cut on straight grain, not on bias, so it doesn't have a lot of stretch to it. And we are going to put it on the edge of our seam allowance. Let me get my pins, because I do wanna use a few pins. And I'm just going to make sure that my edges line up and I have the right side against the seam allowance. Couple pins there in case it shifts on me. And then once we get it pinned all along the edge, notice we're just working against the seam allowance. Then we're gonna come over to the machine, and I'm going to stitch it at 1/4 inch. My actual seam was 5/8. So I'm going to stitch it at 1/4, and remember everything is out of the way and I'm only stitching on the one side of the seam allowance. So we're gonna, and as you're holding it, feel and make sure all of that is kept back, that nothing like slips under, or your little friend the seam ripper will have to come out. You notice I have a little extra on the ends. I just cut them a little long because you can cut them down once you finish your seam. So I have that stitched at 1/4 inch, and you can see that the other side is stitched there nice. I'm going to come over to my ironing board, and I'm gonna just give that a quick press. And then I'm going to press this over the seam and make sure it's good and flat. And then I'm going to flip it over, and here's my seam allowance and where I just stitched. So that's the stitch line and then the fold. And I'm going to bring this material clear over. I'm not gonna fold it back on the seam, I'm gonna fold it over the seam allowance. So you can see that it's coming I'm folding it right here on the edge of the seam allowance. I'm gonna press that down. So it should be about 3/8 of an inch. And I'm gonna come back over to my machine. So you can see on this side that I have about 1/4 inch of the contrasting material showing. And I'm just gonna put a couple pins so it doesn't shift on me. And now the fun part of stitching in the ditch. So in the ditch is you'll be stitching right in, do it this way, right in that seam. And it takes some practice to stitch right there, but you start out with your needle right down in that seam and just concentrate to stay in that seam. Some machines have a stitch in the ditch presser foot, which this one does, and I love to use it, but for you guys today, I'm not going to get it out, and I'm gonna show you how to stitch in the ditch. So I'm gonna put my needle down right in the seam line. Now I can take this guy out. Drop him down, and this machine, if you can see it, this machine has this center notch, and so I just follow that center notch down this seam line, and that should keep me in the ditch. So also kind of at an angle here so you can see. Can you see that pretty good? And it's okay to go kind of slow. And I'm feeling on the back to make sure that I'm keeping this flat, that it's not curling on me, and that it's staying flat. See how we did. This contrasting white shows everything. I'm going to go ahead and trim that seam off as well. So stitching in the ditch, it should be right in the seam, not up on your material, but it should be on the seam allowance side, but in the ditch. So by going slow, it did stay in there pretty well. And we're going to look at the back, and it should be just on the seam allowance. So you see how we basically tack down that seam allowance. It looks like I needed to have pulled it over a little bit more. It slipped on me a little bit, but you can easily fix those things once you finish. When you look at the right side, it looks really clean and nice, a nice contrast. So if that was in, down the side seams of a jacket or in the shoulder area, really pretty contrast. I'm gonna switch out because I already have a sample that I made with both sides, so you can see how nice that looks. On the outside, of course, you can't tell any different. But a nice pop of color in the inside. So you can use any kind of interesting contrast with the Hong Kong seam finish. Use satiny materials, bright colors, anything that you want. This is where the design feature comes in and makes it really cool. Now, if you're a buyer in the apparel industry or work in the merchandising, this seam finish takes more time, so your price points will be higher, but a really, really cool look. So know what you're looking for when you're out there buying or as a consumer, but know that this is a much more expensive seam finish. So if you're buying something that is designer, or a price point that's higher, they should have some cool intricacies in the inside of the garment as well. So thank you for watching the Hong Kong seam finish, and we have one more industry seam finish to do. So come back to my next tutorial.